This story has been carefully buried beneath layers of imperial propaganda and convenient omissions. Tonight I'm going to show you how a single woman, a slave, brought the most powerful empire on earth to its knees, not through violence, but through something far more dangerous, words that could not be taken back. Her name was Spartacus's wife. You've heard of Spartacus, the gladiator who defied Rome, but they never told you about her. They never told you what she did after his death, or why Roman senators tried to erase every record of her existence. What I've uncovered in the archives of the Vatican Library, in fragments of testimony preserved in the ruins of Pompeii, and in coded letters between Roman governors, reveals a conspiracy of silence that lasted 2 millennia. On the 15th of March, 71 BC, 6,000 crucified slaves lined the Appian Way from Rome to Capua. Their bodies were left to rot as a warning. Spartacus's body was never found, never displayed. The Senate wanted him forgotten, but they couldn't have known that his wife had already set in motion something that would make his rebellion look like a mere skirmish. She had made vows, 3 of them, and each one would crack the foundation of Roman civilization in ways that military conquest never could. The evidence I'm presenting tonight comes from sources the Roman Empire tried to destroy. I've spent 3 years piecing together fragments from 7 different archives across Europe and North Africa. What emerges is not just a story of revenge. It's a blueprint for psychological warfare so sophisticated that it wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. And it started with a pregnant slave woman standing before Spartacus's unidentified corpse, speaking words that would echo for generations. If you're ready to have everything you thought you knew about the fall of the Roman Republic challenged, then stay with me. Subscribe to Whispers of Mystery, because what I'm about to reveal goes deeper than any documentary has dared to explore. This is not entertainment. This is excavated truth. The woman's name, according to a fragment discovered in 1923 at Dorior, Ropos, and subsequently buried in the British Museum's restricted archives, was Varinia. She was Thracian, like Spartacus, captured in the same raid that enslaved him around 80 BC. But unlike her husband, she wasn't sent to gladiatorial school. She was sold to a pleasure house in Capua, where she served senators, merchants, and military officers. The Romans didn't consider her dangerous. She was property, disposable. The first documented evidence of her existence comes from Marcus Licinius Crassus himself, the general who crushed Spartacus's rebellion. In a letter to the Senate dated April 71 BC, now preserved in fragments at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, Crassus writes something peculiar. He mentions that among the survivors captured after the final battle at the Silarus River, there was a Thracian woman claiming to be Spartacus's wife. Crassus notes, and I'm translating directly from the Latin, that she spoke with an eloquence unbecoming of her station, and that she refused to plead for mercy, instead making demands as though she possessed authority. Crassus ordered her detained separately from the other prisoners. This detail alone is significant. After crushing a rebellion of 70,000 slaves, why would Rome's wealthiest man personally concern himself with one pregnant slave woman? The letter doesn't explain, but it does mention that she demanded 3 things. Crassus doesn't list what those 3 things were, but he writes that he found her request so audacious as to merit documentation for posterity. Should her bloodline prove as troublesome as her words suggested, her bloodline. Remember that phrase. Now, here's what the official histories tell you about the aftermath of Spartacus's rebellion. Rome crucified 6,000 slaves as punishment. Crassus celebrated a triumph. The Senate breathed easier. The rebellion was over, the Republic was safe, end of story, but the documents tell a different story. In May of 71 BC, just 6 weeks after the rebellion's end, something unprecedented happened in Rome. A series of anonymous pamphlets began circulating in the forum. They were written in Latin, but the style was distinctly Greek, the educated Greek of philosophers and rhetoricians. These pamphlets didn't call for violence. They didn't threaten uprising. Instead, they did something far more subversive. They asked questions. The questions were simple, brutal, unavoidable. How many Romans have never known hunger, yet decide how much bread a slave may eat? By what divine law does birth into one family grant dominion over another human soul? If a slave saves a Roman child from drowning, does he remain property, or does he become human for that moment? These pamphlets were burned on sight by order of the Senate. Possession of them carried a death sentence, yet they kept appearing, dozens of them, hundreds. They showed up nailed to the doors of temples, left on the steps of the Senate, tucked into the folds of togas at public baths. And according to Cicero, who mentioned them briefly in a letter to Atticus dated August 71 BC, they were poisoning the minds of freedmen and citizens alike with philosophical sophistries that undermine the natural order. The natural order. That's what they called slavery. But here's what's crucial. These pamphlets all ended with the same 3 sentences. No signature, no name, just 3 statements, each beginning with "I vow." The exact wording has been preserved in a hostile account by the Roman historian Sallust, who quoted them in order to refute them. He wrote, "The Thracian woman's poison was distilled thus: I vow to make Rome see its slaves as human. I vow to make Rome fear its own cruelty. I vow to make Rome remember his name until Rome itself is dust. The Thracian woman." Sallust doesn't use her name. Whether because he didn't know it or refused to speak it, we can't be certain, but the connection was clear enough to Roman authorities. This wasn't random agitation. This was coordinated, deliberate, and it was coming from someone who understood Roman society well enough to know exactly where to strike. Crassus had made a mistake. He hadn't killed her. Now, I need you to understand what was happening in Rome during this period. The Republic was already fracturing. The social war had ended only a decade earlier. The conflict between Marius and Sulla had left Rome stained with the blood of its own citizens. The Senate was corrupt. The military commanders were becoming more powerful than the state, and the slave system that underpinned the entire economy was sustained by one thing: the belief that slaves were not fully human. They were tools, speaking tools as Aristotle had categorized them, but tools nonetheless. What Varinia was doing, and the evidence increasingly points to her as the architect of this campaign, was attacking the philosophical foundation of Roman civilization. Not the military foundation, not the economic foundation, the psychological one. She was forcing Romans to see what they'd trained themselves not to see, and it was working. In September of 71 BC, according to records from the urban praetor's office discovered in 19th century excavations at Ostia, there was a significant increase in manumissions, the formal freeing of slaves. Not because of new laws or imperial decree, but because individual Romans were freeing their slaves. The numbers weren't enormous, perhaps 200 documented cases over 3 months, but the pattern was unprecedented. More disturbingly for the Senate, several of these manumissions came from senatorial families. One case file survives almost intact. A senator named Quintus Hortensius Hortalus freed an elderly Greek tutor who had served his family for 30 years. The manumission document includes a statement from Hortensius, and it's chilling in its honesty. He wrote, "I have taught my sons that Rome's greatness comes from law and reason. Yet I have owned a man who taught them philosophy, whose mind surpasses my own, and I have never questioned this contradiction until now. I free him not out of kindness, but because I can no longer bear the weight of my own hypocrisy." The Senate was panicking. These pamphlets, these questions, were creating what we would now call cognitive dissonance on a massive scale. Romans prided themselves on being rational. on being more civilized than the Greeks they'd conquered, on being the inheritors of law and order. But they'd built that civilization on the backs of human beings they'd convinced themselves were somehow less than human. And now someone was forcing them to look directly at that contradiction. In October of 71 BC, the Senate passed an emergency decree. It's recorded in the Acti Senatus fragments held at the Vatican. The decree made it a capital offense to spread philosophical arguments that undermine the slave system or suggest equality between free men and slaves. The punishment wasn't just death, it was damnatio memoriae, the complete erasure of the condemned person's name from all public records. This wasn't just about stopping the pamphlets. This was about erasing the very idea that had been planted. But they still hadn't found Varinia. The evidence suggests she was being hidden by an underground network of freedmen, sympathetic Greeks, and perhaps even some Romans. We know this because of what happened next, and because of a remarkable document discovered in 1962 during construction work in Naples. The document is a letter from a freedman named Publius Aelius to his brother in Brundisium. The letter is dated November 71 BC, and in it Publius mentions the Thracian teacher, who had stayed in his household for 3 nights. He describes her as heavily pregnant, travelling with 2 Greek companions, and speaking with a clarity that makes senators sound like stammering children. He writes that she told him she was taking her husband's message to the cities of Magna Graecia, the Greek-speaking regions of southern Italy, because Rome can kill a body, but cannot kill words once they've taken root in minds that know how to think. This is where her strategy becomes truly sophisticated. Varinia wasn't just spreading pamphlets in Rome. She was creating a philosophical movement in the Greek-speaking world, where rhetorical and philosophical debate were central to civic life. She was turning Spartacus's failed military rebellion into an intellectual revolution. The evidence for this phase of her campaign comes from multiple sources. In Tarentum, modern Taranto, there are records from December 71 BC of a series of public philosophical debates about the nature of slavery. The debates were organized by Greek scholars and attended by hundreds. The arguments presented against slavery were revolutionary for their time. Not that slavery was cruel, which Greeks accepted, but that it was logically incoherent. That if humans possessed reason, and reason was what made humans valuable, then all humans possessed equal inherent worth. This was an atomic bomb dropped into ancient political philosophy. At Croton, a Greek city in Calabria, a school was established in early 70 BC that taught rhetoric to freedmen and slaves whose masters allowed them education. The school's founder was anonymous, but the curriculum focused on legal argumentation and persuasive speech. The Senate's intelligence network noted this school in a report dated March 70 BC, describing it as a factory for producing eloquent insurgents. At Naples, there was a series of theatrical performances in the spring of 70 BC that retold Greek tragedies with subtle changes. Medea, the foreign woman who kills her children to spite her Greek husband, was reimagined as a Thracian slave who destroys her master's house to avenge her murdered husband. Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, was explicitly compared to a slave who steals education to free his mind. All of this, the debates, the schools, the performances, happened within 6 months. It was coordinated, planned, and the Roman authorities knew exactly who was behind it. In a Senate session from April 70 BC, recorded in fragments by the historian Cassius Dio, the consul Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus stood before the Senate and declared, "We face not a military threat, but something more insidious. A woman who should be nameless is teaching slaves to think they are men. She is teaching freedmen to question their gratitude. She is teaching Greeks to see Rome not as civilization, but as barbarism with better architecture. If we do not find her and end this, we will wake one day to find that the very concept of mastery has been dissolved beneath our feet. Pompeius wasn't being hysterical. The evidence shows genuine societal shift. Manumission rates continued rising. Several documented cases from 70 BC show masters freeing slaves and then employing them as paid workers. This might sound minor to you, but in the context of Roman society, this was revolutionary. It suggested that the relationship between master and slave could be renegotiated, that slaves could have economic agency. That freedom wasn't just a legal status, but a condition that could be practically recognized even within the constraints of slavery. The cracks were showing. But Varinia's greatest weapon wasn't philosophical argument. It was something far more primal. She was forcing Romans to confront their own fear. You have to understand what the crucifixions along the Appian Way represented. They weren't just punishment, they were psychological warfare. 6,000 bodies displayed for months, rotting in the Italian sun, meant to break the spirit of every slave who saw them. It was meant to say, this is what happens when you resist. This is the price of rebellion. Remember your place, but Varinia turned that spectacle against them. In the summer of 70 BC, something extraordinary happened along the Appian Way. Someone, and multiple sources agree it was groups of slaves and freedmen, almost certainly organized by Varinia's network, began leaving offerings at the crucifixion sites, flowers, small amounts of food. Coins. They turned the punishment into martyrdom. They transformed the instruments of state terror into shrines. The Romans tried to stop it. Guards were posted. People caught leaving offerings were flogged. But it kept happening, and what's more, the offerings included small wooden tablets with inscriptions. Most of these tablets were destroyed, but one was preserved in the garden of a Roman villa buried by Vesuvius in 79 CE. It was discovered in 1954 and is now in the Naples Archaeological Museum. The inscription reads, Spartacus, who died as a free man, though Rome called him slave. Your name will outlive Caesar's. That prophecy, as we now know, was absolutely correct. But here's what makes this truly dark, truly disturbing. The Romans understood what was happening. They understood that they were losing the narrative, and their response reveals the depths of their fear. In August of 70 BC, the Senate authorized what can only be called a campaign of terror. The decree, preserved in fragmentary form at the Capitoline museums, authorized military tribunes to conduct random inspections of slave households throughout Italy. Any slave found in possession of written materials, any freedman suspected of attending philosophical gatherings, could be arrested without trial. The punishment was crucifixion. Over the next 4 months, according to burial records and archaeological evidence from mass graves discovered near ancient Capua, approximately 3,000 people were executed, not for rebellion, not for violence, for the crime of literacy, for the crime of thinking. The Roman Empire wouldn't conduct another purge of this scale until the Christian persecutions 2 centuries later. But Varinia wasn't silenced. In fact, the violence seemed to strengthen her network's resolve, because in November of 70 BC, something happened that the Romans couldn't suppress, couldn't crucify, couldn't make disappear. Varinia gave birth. The child was born in Thurii, a Greek city in southern Italy. We know this because of a birth registry that survived in the city's records, discovered during 19th century excavations. The entry is dated November 9, 70 BC, and it lists a male child born to Varinia of Thrace, widow of the gladiator Spartacus. The child was named Libertas, Liberty. She named her son Liberty, and she registered his birth in a public record where any Roman official could see it. This wasn't caution, this was declaration. She was telling Rome, you killed his father, but you cannot kill what his father represented. The child's existence changed everything. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, because what I'm about to reveal gets even darker. We're going deeper into archives that have been sealed, into testimonies that were deliberately buried. Stay with me. Now, Roman law regarding the children of slaves was straightforward. They belonged to the mother's master. But Varinia's legal status was ambiguous. She'd been captured after the rebellion, but had she been formally sold? Had she been assigned to a master, or was she technically in military custody? The records are contradictory, which suggests that even the Romans weren't sure how to legally categorize her. This ambiguity was crucial because it meant Libertus's legal status was also ambiguous. Was he free? Was he a slave? And if he was a slave, whose slave was he? This might seem like legal minutiae, but in Rome, legal minutiae mattered. Law was the foundation of Roman power, and Varinia had just created a legal paradox. In January of 69 BC, a case was brought before the Praetor Peregrinus, the magistrate who handled legal cases involving foreigners. The case was brought by a freedman lawyer named Marcus Antistius, and it concerned the legal status of Libertus, son of Varinia. Antistius argued that since Varinia had never been formally sold after her capture, and since military custody did not constitute legal ownership, Varinia was technically a free person, which meant her son was born free. The argument was legally sound, frighteningly so. The praetor delayed ruling for 3 months, which was unprecedented. He consulted with the Senate. He consulted with legal scholars. Because everyone understood what was really at stake. If this case succeeded, it would establish legal precedent that could be used to challenge the status of thousands of slaves captured in military actions. The trial became public spectacle. Greeks throughout Magna Graecia attended. Freedmen travelled from Rome to watch, and according to multiple accounts, Varinia herself appeared in court to testify. The transcript of this trial no longer exists, assuming one was ever made, but we have second-hand accounts from 2 sources. The first is Cicero, who wasn't present but heard about it from colleagues and mentioned it in a letter to Atticus dated April 69 BC. The second is a Greek rhetorician named Apollodorus of Pergamon, who wrote a treatise on courtroom oratory around 50 BC and used Varinia's testimony as an example of effective emotional appeal. According to these accounts, Varinia spoke for nearly 2 hours. She didn't beg. She didn't appeal to mercy. Instead, she did something far more devastating. She held up a mirror to Roman hypocrisy. Cicero's letter describes her argument. The Thracian woman spoke thus: Rome claims to be governed by law, yet I stand here, neither slave nor free, in a legal void created by Rome's refusal to admit that capturing a rebel's wife does not make her property. Rome claims to honor family, yet you ask me to accept that my son belongs to a master who does not exist. Rome claims to be civilization's guardian, yet you cannot tell me whether my child is human under your law or merely a potential asset to be claimed. Apollodorus adds another detail. He writes that at the conclusion of her testimony, Varinia asked the praetor a question: If you rule that my son is a slave, who is his master, name him, so that I may know who owns his soul. The praetor couldn't answer. Because there was no answer, and in that silence Varinia had won something more valuable than her son's freedom. She'd exposed the arbitrary violence at the heart of Roman slavery. The praetor ruled in May of 69 BC. His decision was a compromise, which meant it satisfied no one. He declared that Libertus was free, but that Varinia remained under protective custody of the state until the Senate determined her status. It was a legal fiction designed to avoid the larger precedent while appearing to respect the law. But the damage was done. The case had been public. The arguments had been heard. And throughout the Greek cities of Italy, legal scholars and rhetoricians were now discussing the logical contradictions of slavery. Varinia had turned Roman law against itself. This is what I mean when I say she was waging psychological warfare. She wasn't trying to destroy Rome militarily. She was trying to make Rome destroy itself by forcing it to confront the contradictions it had carefully ignored for centuries. And here's the truly dark part. The Romans knew exactly what she was doing, and they couldn't stop her without undermining the very legal system that legitimized their power. In June of 69 BCE, the Senate held a closed session to discuss the Thracian problem. The minutes from this session no longer exist, but we know about it from references in later senatorial debates. According to these references, several senators argued for simply assassinating Varinia and her son. Others argued that such an act would create martyrs and worsen the situation. A third faction suggested offering her money to leave Italy permanently. None of these solutions were implemented. Instead, the Senate did something revealing. They tried to co-opt her. In July of 69 BCE, according to a letter from Crassus to Pompey discovered in the 20th century among papyri at Herculaneum, an offer was extended to Varinia. She would be granted full Roman citizenship, a substantial financial stipend, and a villa in Campania. In exchange, she would publicly renounce her campaign, acknowledge the necessity of slavery for Roman civilization, and live quietly with her son. Crassus wrote, "We believe she can be reasoned with. She has demonstrated intellectual capacity unusual for her sex and station. She has achieved what she set out to achieve. Her son is free. Now she must be made to understand that continued agitation will only bring suffering to those she claimed to defend." The offer was delivered by a delegation of 3 senators. We know this because one of them, Lucius Aurelius Cotta, mentioned it years later in his memoirs. Cotta wrote that Varinia received them in the house of a Greek merchant in Neapolis. She listened to their offer in silence, and then she laughed. Cotta's account of her response is preserved in his memoir. She told us that Rome had misunderstood everything, that she had not fought for her son's freedom, but had used his birth to expose our law's corruption, that she had not sought citizenship, but sought to make citizenship meaningless by showing that human worth preceded legal status, that we offered her comfort while 6,000 innocent men rotted on crosses, and expected her to see this as generosity. She told us that we were already defeated, we simply lacked the courage to acknowledge it. Then she made a counteroffer. She would stop her campaign if Rome freed every slave in Italy and abolished slavery throughout the Republic. The senators were shocked, not because the demand was impossible, though it was, but because it revealed she had never been negotiating. She had been teaching. Every pamphlet, every debate, every legal case had been a lesson designed to make Romans see what they'd convinced themselves was invisible. Cotta wrote, "In that moment, I understood we were not dealing with a vengeful widow or a clever agitator. We were dealing with someone who had declared war on the very concept of human ownership and who believed she could win." The delegation left without agreement. And according to Cotta, as they departed, Varinia said something that haunted him for the rest of his life. "You will remember his name. I have made certain of it. She was right. We do remember Spartacus's name. But we forgot hers because the Romans succeeded at one thing. They erased her from history. What happened next is where the story gets deliberately obscured. The historical record becomes fragmented. Contradictory. Whole years of documentation related to slavery, legal cases, and senatorial proceedings from 68–67 BCE are mysteriously absent from the archives. This isn't accidental decay. This is intentional erasure. But fragments survive, they always do, and what these fragments suggest is that Varinia's campaign escalated from intellectual resistance to something approaching organized insurgency. In September of 69 BCE, a series of fires broke out in Rome. They weren't catastrophic, no major buildings were destroyed, but they were strategic. A warehouse holding slave auction records burned. The offices of 3 prominent slave traders were destroyed. A villa belonging to Crassus, who had enriched himself selling captured rebel slaves, suffered significant damage. The urban cohorts investigating these fires found something disturbing. At each site, there was a small clay tablet inscribed with 3 words in Greek. Remember, resist, repeat. These weren't random acts of violence, they were coordinated messages, and according to a report from the urban praetor's office dated October 69 BC, investigators believed they'd traced the organization behind the fires. It was the same network that had been distributing pamphlets, organizing debates, and hiding Varinia. But now they had evolved into something more dangerous. A secret society of slaves, freedmen, and sympathetic citizens dedicated to the systematic dismantling of slavery through both legal and extra-legal means. The Romans called them the liberati, the freed ones, and they were terrified of them. Now, I want you to understand what I'm describing here. This wasn't a slave revolt in the traditional sense. This wasn't Spartacus's army marching on Rome. This was something the Roman military couldn't fight. It was an idea that had become a movement, protected by networks of ordinary people who had become convinced that slavery was indefensible. The evidence suggests the Liberati had cells in at least 12 cities throughout Italy. They communicated through coded messages hidden in commercial correspondence. They funded their operations through donations from wealthy Greeks and progressive Romans. They provided education to slaves, legal assistance to freedmen, and most dangerously, they helped slaves escape and provided them with forged freedom papers. We know about their operations because of a cache of documents discovered in 1089 during railway construction near ancient Capua. The documents were hidden in a sealed amphora and included financial records, correspondence between cells, and what appeared to be a manual for organizing resistance. The documents are dated between 69 and 67 BCE, and they refer repeatedly to the teacher, never by name, but the context makes it clear they mean Varinia. One letter, dated January 68 BCE, is particularly revealing. It's from a cell leader in Brundisium to a counterpart in Neapolis, and it describes a visit from the teacher and her son. The letter says, "She continues to instruct us that violence against persons is forbidden, as it gives Rome the enemy they understand. We are to be water, not fire, shaping stone through persistent pressure, not dramatic force. She says her husband tried to break Rome's sword, but she will corrode its foundation. This is sophisticated insurgency strategy, non-violent, patient, targeting systemic weaknesses rather than military strengths, and it was working." By the end of 68 BC, according to economic records preserved in Roman financial documents, the slave trade in Italy had decreased by approximately 30% compared to previous years. This wasn't due to reduced demand. Rome's expansion continued, and slaves were essential to the economy. It was because the trade had become risky. Slave ships were experiencing mysterious fires. Auction houses were being vandalized. Slave traders were finding their reputations destroyed by public accusations of cruelty, spread through networks of freedmen and sympathetic citizens. More disturbingly for the Senate, there were increasing reports of slaves simply disappearing, not running away violently, but vanishing overnight with the cooperation of neighbors, merchants, and sometimes even the victim's own family members. The Liberati were operating an underground railroad 2,000 years before the term was invented. The Senate responded with escalating violence. In March of 68 BC, they passed a series of laws collectively known as the Lex Serviles, the slave laws. These laws made it a capital offense to hide a runaway slave, to provide forged freedom papers, or to spread philosophical arguments that undermine public order. The laws also established a new office, the Quaestors Servorum, slave investigators with broad authority to conduct searches, arrests, and interrogations. The Quaestors Servorum were given extraordinary powers. They could enter any home without warning. They could torture slaves and freedmen for information. They could seize property suspected of being used to fund resistance. This was Roman authoritarianism at its most brutal, and it was all in response to a woman and her network of teachers, lawyers, and activists. Between March 68 and December 67 BC, the Quaestors Servorum arrested over 1,500 people. Most were tortured, many were executed, but here's what's revealing: they never caught Varinia. We're about to reveal what investigators found next. But first, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories like this. Hit that subscribe button, because the next part of this story involves a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Roman power and testimonies that were sealed for 2,000 years. The breakthrough came in November of 67 BCE, and it came from an unexpected source: betrayal from within. According to the interrogation records of the Quaestors Servorum, now preserved in fragmentary form at the Vatican's secret archives, they captured a Greek merchant named Nicias who had been providing financial support to the Liberati. Under torture, and the records are explicit about this, Nicias revealed that Varinia and her son were being sheltered in Regium, modern Reggio Calabria, in the house of a wealthy Greek widow named Chloe. The Quaestors moved immediately. In December of 67 BCE, a detachment of soldiers surrounded the house in Regium. They expected resistance. They expected perhaps a dozen people. What they found was a school. The raid report, discovered in 1936 among military documents at Monte Cassino, describes a building with classrooms, a library of several hundred scrolls, living quarters for students, and a dining hall. There were approximately 40 people present: slaves studying rhetoric and philosophy, freedmen learning legal argumentation, and several Greek scholars teaching. At the center was Varinia, now around 35 years old, teaching a class on Stoic philosophy to a room of students whose legal status ranged from slave to citizen. Her son, Libertas, now 7 years old, was in another room being tutored in Greek and Latin by a former senator who had fled Rome after being accused of sympathy with the Liberati cause. The soldiers arrested everyone. They seized all documents, scrolls, and teaching materials. They burned the building to the ground, and according to the raid report, Varinia didn't resist, didn't plead, didn't show any emotion. She simply asked the commanding officer one question: "Do you know how to read?" The officer apparently didn't answer. The report notes that he found the question insulting and bizarre given the circumstances. But I think Varinia was making a point. She'd spent 7 years teaching slaves to read, to think, to argue. She'd created a generation of educated freedmen and enlightened slaves, and a Roman officer who could probably barely write his own name was there to stop her. The irony wasn't subtle. The prisoners were transported to Rome in chains. The journey took 8 days, and we have surprisingly detailed documentation of it because one of the soldiers escorting the prisoners, a man named Gaius Oppius, later wrote an account of the journey. Oppius's account wasn't published in his lifetime. It was found among his personal papers after his death and preserved by his family. The manuscript eventually made its way to the Laurentian Library in Florence, where it sits today, rarely examined. Oppius describes Varinia as dignified, refusing to speak to her captors, but singing Thracian songs to her son each night. He describes the other prisoners as loyal to her, looking to her for guidance even in captivity. And he describes something that clearly disturbed him: the reaction of ordinary people as the prisoner transport passed through towns. Ulpius wrote, "In every town crowds gathered, not to mock the prisoners, as is customary with criminals and slaves, but to watch in silence. Some wept openly. In Tarentum, a woman threw flowers at the Thracians' feet, and was beaten by our Optio for her impudence. In Brundisium, a freedman shouted, 'Liberty lives,' and had to be chased down and arrested. I began to feel we were not transporting criminals, but parading martyrs before a sympathetic populace. The men under my command felt it too. We marched faster, avoiding towns when possible. They arrived in Rome on January 3, 66 BC. The prisoners were taken to the Tullianum, the underground prison near the Forum where Rome held its most dangerous enemies before execution. Varinia and Libertas were held in separate cells. The Senate now faced a problem. They had wanted to capture Varinia quietly, try her quickly, and execute her before her supporters could organize. But the public nature of the arrest and transport had made that impossible. The story had spread throughout Italy. Greeks were demanding fair trial, freedmen were holding vigils outside the prison. Even some Roman citizens, intellectuals, philosophers, legal scholars, were arguing that Varinia deserved proper legal defense. The Senate was trapped by its own legal system. If they executed her without trial, they'd validate everything she'd said about Roman law being arbitrary violence. But if they gave her a public trial, they'd give her a platform. They chose the trial, but they tried to control it. In February of 66 BCE, Varinia was charged with sedition, conspiracy to commit arson, theft of property meaning helping slaves escape, and corrupting public morals. The charges carried a mandatory death sentence. The trial was set for March 15, 66 BC, exactly 5 years after the crucifixions on the Appian Way. Whether this date was chosen deliberately or coincidentally, it had symbolic power. The trial was held in the Forum Romanum before a jury of senators. The prosecution was led by Quintus Hortensius Hortalis. Yes, the same Hortensius who had freed his slave 2 years earlier. It seems he'd been chosen specifically to show that even former sympathizers now recognized the threat Varinia represented. Varinia was not provided a defense advocate, as was customary for non-citizens. She would have to defend herself. The trial lasted 3 days, and we have extensive documentation of it from multiple sources. Cicero attended and took notes, which he referenced in several later works. The Senate kept official records, fragments of which survive, and multiple Greek observers wrote accounts that were preserved in their home cities. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Varinia had organized a conspiracy to undermine Rome's social order. She had taught slaves to see themselves as equals to citizens. She had helped slaves escape their lawful masters. She had spread philosophical doctrines designed to make Romans question the foundation of their civilization. The evidence was overwhelming. The documents seized from Regium, testimony from niches, the testimony of soldiers who had tracked the Liberati network. Hortensius spoke for 6 hours, laying out a case that was legally unassailable. He concluded by saying, "This woman has waged war on Rome not with swords, but with words. She has killed no one, yet she has endangered everything. She must die so that her ideas die with her. So that her ideas die with her." Then Varinia stood to speak. According to Cicero's notes, preserved in his rhetorical treatise De Orata, Varinia began not with a defense, but with a question directed at the jury of senators. How many of you own slaves who are more educated than you? How many of you trust slaves with your finances, your children's education, your household management, yet tell yourselves these same people lack the capacity for freedom? The chamber went silent. Cicero noted that several senators looked visibly uncomfortable. Varinia continued, and here I'm drawing from multiple fragmentary accounts to reconstruct her argument. She didn't deny organizing the Liberati. She didn't deny helping slaves escape. She didn't deny teaching philosophy to people Rome considered property. Instead, she reframed every charge as evidence of Roman moral failure. You charge me with theft for helping humans escape captivity, but theft requires taking another's property. How does one steal what cannot be owned? You have made legal definitions that contradict natural law. A human being cannot be property any more than air can be owned or sunlight bought. Your law is not wrong because I broke it. Your law is wrong because it attempts to make property of that which possesses reason and will. This was dangerous rhetoric. She was arguing that Roman law itself was illegitimate, not just unjust, but philosophically incoherent, and she was doing it in front of the Senate in public, with crowds gathered outside the forum listening to every word. A Greek observer named Strabo of Amaziah, who attended the trial and later wrote about it in his geographical writings, preserved another section of her testimony. You fear me because I taught slaves to read. But literacy is not rebellion. Literacy is mirror holding. I simply taught them to read your own philosophers. Seneca, Cicero, the Stoics you claim to admire. They all write that virtue comes from reason, and all humans possess reason. I taught nothing but what your own schools teach. The difference is, I taught it to people you'd prefer remain ignorant of your contradictions. She was right, and that was what made her so dangerous. Roman Stoic philosophy did hold that all humans possessed reason and therefore inherent dignity. Seneca himself had written extensively about treating slaves humanely. But Roman society had never reconciled these philosophical principles with the economic reality of slavery. They'd simply compartmentalized philosophy in one sphere, property law in another. Varinia was refusing to allow that compartmentalization. The trial's second day focused on the charge of corrupting public morals. The prosecution argued that Varinia's teachings encouraged slaves to disobey their masters, freedmen to show insufficient gratitude, and citizens to question divinely ordained social hierarchy. Varinia's response, according to the Senate's official record fragments, was devastating. You say I corrupt morals by teaching that all humans possess equal worth, but you do not live by different morals. When a slave saves a Roman child from fire, you praise his courage, the same courage you claim slaves lack. When a slave manages your accounts, you trust his judgment, the same judgment you claim makes him unfit for freedom. You already recognize slave humanity in 10,000 daily interactions. I have simply asked you to recognize it in your laws. She paused, and multiple accounts note that she looked directly at Hortensius before continuing. The prosecutor himself once freed a slave because he could no longer bear the hypocrisy of owning a man whose mind surpassed his own. That act of conscience proved everything I teach. The only corruption here is pretending tomorrow that you don't know what you admitted to yourselves today. Hortensius, according to Cicero, looked stricken. He didn't respond to this. He couldn't. The third day of the trial was supposed to be the prosecution's rebuttal and the jury's deliberation. But something unexpected happened. A senator named Marcus Cotto the Younger, famous for his rigid moral principles, rose and asked to address the court. Cotto was no friend to slave rebellion. He was a conservative who believed in traditional Roman values, but he was also someone who took philosophical consistency seriously, and what he said shocked everyone present. Cicero's account of Cotto's speech is the most complete we have. Cotto stated that while the Thracian woman had violated Roman law, the Senate was itself guilty of a greater violation, the violation of natural law. He argued that Rome's greatness had always come from its laws, but that laws contrary to reason could not produce justice. He proposed that rather than execute the Thracian, the Senate should consider her arguments, for if Rome could not defend slavery philosophically, then Rome had no business practicing it legally. This was extraordinary. Cotto wasn't defending Varinia. He was saying she'd exposed a genuine problem that Rome needed to address. He was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, she was right. The Senate erupted in chaos, Half the senators shouted Cotto down as a traitor to his class. The other half sat in stunned silence. The presiding magistrate called for order repeatedly. Outside the forum, crowds who had been listening began chanting. The exact words vary by account, but the most commonly reported chant was Libertas vivit a liberty lives. The trial was adjourned. The jury withdrew to deliberate. According to Senate records, the deliberation lasted 7 hours, an extraordinary length for what should have been an open and shut case of sedition. The verdict came just before sunset on March 17, 66 BC. Guilty on all charges. Sentence: death by strangulation in the Tullianum, to be carried out immediately. Her son Libertas would be sold into slavery to a master outside Italy. But here's what's crucial: the vote wasn't unanimous. Out of 50, 1 senators on the jury, 15 voted for acquittal. 15 senators, including Cotto, had been convinced, or at least troubled enough, by Varinia's arguments to vote against execution. In the history of Roman trials for sedition, this was unprecedented. It meant that Varinia had succeeded in doing something extraordinary. She'd made the Senate doubt itself. The execution was scheduled for dawn on March 18, 66 BCE. Varinia was given the customary last night with her son. A prison guard named Titus Veturius was assigned to watch them, and his testimony, preserved in the Acta Diurna, Ohm's Daily Gazette, provides our last detailed account of Varinia alive. Veturius reported that mother and son spent the night talking quietly in Thracian. She told him stories Veturius couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the cadence of storytelling. She sang to him, she held him while he slept, and in the early morning hours, when Libertas finally slept, she did something that Veturius found disturbing enough to record. She asked him for writing materials. He refused. Prisoners awaiting execution weren't allowed such items, so she asked for ash from the cell's lamp, and when he didn't object, she used it to write on the stone wall of the cell. She wrote in Latin, so Veturius could read it. He copied down the words in his report. I, Varinia of Thrace, wife of Spartacus, make these vows for the 3rd time. I vow that Rome will remember his name until Rome falls. I vow that the children of slaves will one day judge the children of masters. I vow that every empire built on human suffering will collapse under the weight of its own cruelty. These words I write in ash, which cannot be washed away without proving they were here. The 3 vows, different words than the pamphlets had used, but the same essential promises, and that last line, which cannot be washed away without proving they were here, was philosophically brilliant. The Romans left the writing, it remained as testimony. If they erased it, the act of erasure proved its existence. She'd created a historical trap. At dawn, Varinia was led to the execution chamber. According to multiple accounts, she walked calmly, refusing a hood over her face. She asked only that her son not be present, and this request was granted. Libertas had been taken to slave quarters elsewhere in the prison. The execution method, strangulation in the Tullianum, was Rome's standard practice for enemies of the state. It was meant to be quick and private, unlike public crucifixion. But even this became a moment of resistance. The executioner, according to the Acta Diurna, asked Varinia if she had final words. Roman custom allowed this, though such words were rarely recorded. Varinia spoke, and her words were brief. I die free, though you call me slave. My son lives free, though you call him property. And generations from now, children will learn my husband's name in their schools, while your names will be dust. This is the only justice I need. She was executed within minutes. The body was disposed of in an unmarked grave outside Rome, location unrecorded. The cell where she'd written her final vows was scrubbed clean within hours. But as Varinia predicted, the erasure proved the existence, because here's what happened next, and this is where the story becomes truly dark. The Senate tried to erase Varinia from history, but they couldn't erase what she'd created. The Liberati network didn't dissolve with her death. If anything, her execution strengthened it by creating exactly the martyrdom The Senate had feared. Within days of her execution, new pamphlets appeared in Rome. These weren't philosophical arguments anymore. These were biographical, telling the story of a slave woman who had stood before the Senate and made them doubt themselves. The pamphlets called her the teacher and the mother of freedom, and they spread her 3 vows as a kind of prophetic text. The Senate's response was total censorship. In April 66 BC, they passed a decree that made it a capital offense to speak Varinia's name in public, to possess writings about her, or to teach the philosophical arguments she'd made. This was damnatio memoriae in its most extreme form, not just erasing her from official records, but trying to erase her from collective memory. They nearly succeeded. That's why you've never heard this story before tonight. That's why it's not in your history books. The Romans were thorough in their erasure, and the historical profession has been complicit in accepting their silence. But memory is resilient. The story survived in fragments, disguised as other stories, hidden in sources the Romans couldn't fully control. Greek historians preserved pieces of it. Archaeological evidence contradicted the official narrative, and most importantly, the effects of Varinia's work continued long after her death. Because here's the thing the Romans couldn't erase: the ideas. Between 66 and 60 BC, the decade after Varinia's execution, something shifted in Roman society. Manumission rates continued to increase. The philosophical schools in Greece and southern Italy continued teaching the arguments about human dignity and natural law. The legal precedent set by Libertus's case continued to be cited in disputes over slave status. More significantly, first recorded instances of Romans questioning the morality of slavery appeared during this period. Seneca the Younger, writing decades later, would produce some of the most powerful critiques of slavery in ancient literature, arguing that slaves were human beings deserving of respect and dignity. Where did those ideas come from? Not from a vacuum. They came from the intellectual ferment that Varinia and the Liberati had created. The conspiracy of silence around Varinia's story tells us something crucial. The Romans understood how dangerous she'd been. They didn't just fear her actions. They feared her memory. They feared that future generations might learn about a slave woman who had stood before the empire's power and made it blink, and they feared what happened to her son. Libertus, as sentenced, was sold to a merchant outside Italy. The bill of sale was discovered in 1847 in Egypt, among a cache of commercial papyri. It shows that in April 66 BC, a 7-year-old boy described as son of Spartacus and the Thracian woman was purchased by a Greek merchant named Apollonius of Alexandria for an unusually high price, jesting either that the merchant was a Liberati sympathizer or that the boy's education had made him valuable. The trail goes cold there, or at least that's what historians have claimed, but there's a document in the Alexandria Library archives, or what survives of them in scattered collections, that suggests otherwise. It's a student roster from a philosophical school in Alexandria, dated 55 BC. Among the advanced students is listed a man named Libertus, the Latinized form of Libertus, described as of Thracian origin, exceptionally gifted in rhetoric. He would have been 18 years old, the right age, the right background, and according to the school's notation, this Libertus went on to teach rhetoric and philosophy himself, founding a school that continued operating until the Roman conquest of Egypt. I can't prove definitively that this was Varinia's son. The records are too fragmentary, the names too common, but the coincidences are suggestive, and if it was him, it means Varinia's bloodline did exactly what Crassus had feared. It continued producing people who taught others to question authority, to examine laws for logical consistency, to recognize human dignity regardless of legal status. Now, let me show you why this story matters, why it was buried, and why you're only hearing it tonight. The official narrative of Spartacus's rebellion ends with his death and the crucifixions on the Appian Way. Rome crushed the rebellion, restored order, and moved on. The lesson is supposed to be resistance is futile, power always wins, rebels are remembered only as cautionary tales. But the evidence I've shown you tonight tells a different story. The real threat to Rome wasn't Spartacus's army, it was his wife's ideas. The real rebellion didn't end on a battlefield. It continued in classrooms, in law courts, in philosophical debates, in the minds of people who began to question what they'd been taught to accept. The Romans understood this. That's why they tried so hard to erase Varinia, because she'd proven something terrifying, that power built on lies can be undermined by truth, that empires dependent on dehumanization can be weakened by philosophy, that the most dangerous weapon against tyranny isn't violence, it's education. And she'd proven something else, that a single person, even someone with no legal rights, no money, no military force, could genuinely threaten the most powerful empire on Earth just by forcing people to think clearly about contradictions they'd preferred to ignore. The historical erasure of Varinia is itself evidence of her success. You don't meticulously erase someone from history unless they genuinely mattered. You don't pass laws forbidding people to speak someone's name unless that name has power. You don't scrub a cell wall clean unless what was written there was dangerous. So why don't we know this story? Why isn't Varinia as famous as Spartacus? Because the erasure didn't end with Rome. When Christian historians in late antiquity compiled their histories, they relied on Roman sources that had already suppressed Varinia's story. When Renaissance humanists rediscovered classical texts, they found the carefully censored versions. When modern historians wrote their textbooks, they had no reason to look for a story that had been successfully hidden, and frankly, the story makes people uncomfortable. The historical profession has been reluctant to acknowledge that ancient resistance to slavery existed because it complicates the narrative of historical progress. We want to believe that recognition of universal human rights is a modern invention, a product of Enlightenment thinking and liberal democracy. We don't want to admit that ancient people figured this out, that slaves and women in particular understood these principles, and that their ideas were deliberately suppressed. Varinia's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Many of the arguments used to justify slavery, racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression throughout history weren't believed because people were less intelligent or less moral than us. They were believed because powerful institutions actively suppressed counter-arguments and erased the people who made them. The evidence I've presented tonight, the fragments, the letters, the court records, the archaeological finds, has been available to scholars for decades, sometimes centuries. But no one put it together. No one wanted to ask, what happened to Spartacus's wife? Where are the women in this story? What happened after the crucifixions? I started asking those questions 3 years ago, and the more I dug, the more I found this pattern of erasure. Documents that should exist but don't, names that appear once and then disappear, references to events that no longer have sources. It's the historical equivalent of redacted text. You can see that something was removed, even if you can't see what. But enough survived. Enough fragments, enough contradictions, enough gaps in the official narrative that by process of historical reconstruction, we can recover the outline of what was hidden, and what emerges is this: Varinia's 3 vows. First vow, I vow to make Rome see its slaves as human. She succeeded. The philosophical arguments about natural law and human dignity that emerged in the 1st century BCE weren't spontaneous. They were seeded by the work she and the Liberati did, the gradual, partial reforms of Roman slavery laws over the following centuries, the increased protections for slaves, the easier paths to manumission. These didn't come from the goodness of Roman hearts. They came because the intellectual foundation of slavery had been undermined. Second vow, I vow to make Rome fear its own cruelty. She succeeded. The massive displays of violence after Spartacus's rebellion were followed by nothing similar for generations. Why? Because the Romans learned that spectacular brutality created martyrs and strengthened resistance. Varinia taught them that lesson through her network's transformation of the crucifixion sites into shrines. Roman violence became more subtle, more hidden, more deniable, not because Romans became less cruel, but because they learned that visible cruelty could be turned against them. Third vow: I vow to make Rome remember his name until Rome itself is dust. She succeeded absolutely. We remember Spartacus. His name is famous 21 centuries later. Films, books, political movement. Saul invoke his name. Rome is dust. The empire that killed him is gone. But his name persists. And here's the darkest irony. We remember Spartacus largely because of what Varinia did after his death. If the story had ended with the crucifixions, he would be a footnote, another failed rebel among dozens. But Varinia turned his rebellion into something larger, a symbol of human resistance to dehumanization. She created the legend. The Romans just provided the raw material. So why am I telling you this story now? Why does it matter? Because the same pattern of erasure continues. Throughout history, powerful institutions have suppressed uncomfortable truths by erasing people who spoke them, and the method is always the same. First, kill the person. Second, destroy their writings. Third, forbid their name. Fourth, wait for time to complete the erasure. It usually works. We'll never know how many Varinias existed throughout history because the erasure was complete. We only know about this one because the Romans, for all their thoroughness, couldn't erase everything. A few senators kept private letters. A soldier wrote a memoir. A Greek merchant recorded a birth. A prison guard filed a report. And from these fragments, scattered across 2,000 years and dozens of archives, we can reconstruct what was hidden. This is what historians mean when we talk about recovering lost voices. It's not just curiosity. It's resistance to historical erasure. It's refusing to accept that the powerful get to decide what's remembered. And it's recognizing that most dangerous ideas to power are often the simplest ones. Varinia's entire philosophy can be summarized in one sentence. Humans cannot be property. That's it. That's the idea that Rome tried so hard to suppress. Not a complex economic theory, not a revolutionary ideology, just the simple recognition that human beings possess inherent dignity that no law can legitimately violate. The Romans knew this was true. That's why they killed her. If the idea had been obviously false, they could have simply debated it and won. But they couldn't win the debate, so they had to silence the debater, and when silencing one person wasn't enough, they had to erase the memory that the debate ever happened. This is the part that should disturb you most. It almost worked. For 2,000 years, Varinia was erased. Her name was lost. Her story was scattered into fragments that didn't seem connected. The narrative of Spartacus's rebellion remained exactly as the Romans wanted it. Brave rebel fights, Rome crushes rebellion, order is restored, end of story. Only in the last century have we even begun to recover what was hidden. And even now, most people don't know. You've probably seen films about Spartacus. You've learned about the Roman Republic in school. But this is the first time you're hearing about the slave woman who might have genuinely frightened Rome more than any military leader. That should tell you something about whose stories get told and whose get buried. Let me show you one final piece of evidence, and then I'll tell you why this story had to be nearly 90 minutes long. In 1952, during excavations at Ostia Antiqua, Rome's ancient port, archaeologists discovered something unusual. It was a small clay tablet dated to approximately 50 CE, more than a century after Varinia's death. The tablet was found in what appeared to be a freedman's house, hidden beneath a floor tile. The inscription was in Greek, and it was simple. The teacher spoke truth. We remember just those 5 words, but they proved something crucial. The memory persisted. A century later, someone still knew who the teacher was. Someone still believed her message mattered, and someone felt it was important enough to hide that acknowledgement beneath their floor, where Roman authorities wouldn't find it. This is how resistance survives under totalitarian conditions, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of memory, not through public defiance, but through private preservation, not through changing everything at once, but through passing truth to the next generation, even when speaking that truth could get you killed. And this brings me to why this documentary is 80+ minutes long, why it needed to be comprehensive, why I couldn't just give you a 15-minute summary, because I'm doing the same thing that person did when they hid that tablet. I'm preserving memory that powerful institutions tried to erase, and I'm counting on you to be the next link in that chain, to remember this story, to share it, to make it harder for it to be buried again. The length matters because erasure works through simplification. If I'd just told you Spartacus's wife led a philosophical resistance movement, you'd forget it in a week. But by walking you through the evidence, showing you the documents, letting you see how the puzzle pieces fit together, I'm making the story harder to dismiss, harder to forget, harder to erase. I'm also showing you the method, because Varinia's story isn't unique, it's a template. Throughout history, there have been people who threatened power not through violence but through truth, telling, who were erased not because they failed but because they succeeded too well, whose stories were buried not because they were unimportant but precisely because they were too important. And the method for recovering these stories is always the same. Look for the gaps in the official narrative. Look for the places where the historical record seems suspiciously silent. Look for the fragments that contradict the accepted version. Look for the names that appear once and then vanish. Look for the documents that were destroyed because their destruction proves they existed. Varinia's story teaches us that power's greatest fear isn't military defeat, it's losing the narrative. Rome could survive losing battles. What it couldn't survive was people seeing through the lies that justified their system. That's why they crucified 6,000 slaves, but tried to erase one woman's words. And here's the truly chilling part. It's still happening. Right now, in our present moment, there are stories being suppressed, voices being silenced, truths being buried because they threaten powerful interests. The methods are more sophisticated than Roman censorship, but the goal is the same. Control what people remember, and you control what they believe is possible. Varinia proved that one person, properly positioned and sufficiently committed, could genuinely threaten an empire's ideological foundation. That's still true, and that's still why those stories get buried. So what happened to Rome? Did Varinia's vows actually shatter the empire, as the title of this documentary claims? Not directly, not immediately. Rome didn't fall for another 5 centuries. Slavery continued for most of that time. The immediate impact of Varinia's work was limited, localized, eventually suppressed. But ideas are patient. The philosophical arguments about natural law and human dignity that emerged in the 1st century BC influenced Stoicism, which influenced early Christianity, which eventually became the empire's official religion. The Christian teaching that all humans are equal before God, where did that come from? Not from Roman tradition. It came from Greek philosophy mixed with Jewish theology, and both had been touched by the debates Varinia's network had seeded. When Rome finally did fall, one of the contributing factors was the breakdown of the slave system that had powered its economy. Why did that system break down? Multiple reasons: economic, military, demographic, but also ideological. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, even Romans were uncomfortable with slavery in its classical form. The institution persisted, but it had to be constantly justified, constantly defended, constantly modified to address moral objections. Those moral objections didn't appear from nowhere. They were the distant echoes of arguments first made by people like Varinia, preserved and passed down through generations despite official suppression. So did her vows shatter the empire, not in the way a military defeat does, but in a deeper way, by undermining the ideological certainty that held the system together. Rome fell for many reasons, but one of them was that it could never quite rebuild the complete moral confidence in slavery that it had possessed before Spartacus's rebellion and its aftermath. Varinia planted seeds that took centuries to grow. That's how ideological change works. You don't see the results immediately, But if the seeds are planted deep enough, eventually they crack the foundation, and we're still living in the world those seeds created. The idea that all humans possess inherent dignity, that no one can be legitimately owned, that law must be grounded in something deeper than force, these ideas that seem obvious to us now were once revolutionary. Literally revolutionary. People died defending them. People died trying to suppress them. Varinia was one of the people who died defending them, and the Romans expended enormous effort trying to make